the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our discussion, we briefly do want to mention we have a Patreon account, which you can find at www.patreon.com/MUHH. We're providing patrons with access to our Discord server, and we will be doing some reading groups there. We had done some in the past, and we have some additional audio content available for patrons. More stuff is going to be coming in the future once we get schedules and life things situated. So be patient with us, and we'll let you guys know about that. But today we're going to be jumping into Spinoza's Ethics, Part 1, Concerning God. And I think for me, reading this, as I mentioned to you in our kind of text exchange, I have a hard time. I respect what he's doing. Obviously, I respect Spinoza, but I have it's just not the most enjoyable reading because it is very sort of this rationalist mode, which my eyes kind of glaze over a little bit to some extent. That's more my problem and not Spinoza's. So I think for me, the interesting aspects for discussion relate to more so to how Deleuze and Guattari mobilize some of the logic and some of the concepts within the ethics as a whole. I mean, definitely there's plenty here, I think, that they take and use in a very creative and interesting way. But I think that's where my interest lies. So I may let you pass the buck to you and let you perhaps open us up and give us context and kind of wherever you want to start off. And then I think later we can fold into my areas of what I found interesting. So,
yeah, I mean, I know we could do a kind of scholarly exposition of the ethics, but it's one of the great books in modern philosophy, right? There's tons of commentaries out there. I sent you one of them that I looked at just in passing, not fully studying it. But if you want a scholarly presentation of the ethics and really get down into the nitty gritty of, say, the origin of Spinoza's thinking from his relation to Descartes, who he is sort of immediately following from and obviously disagreeing with, but sharing many common notions with as well. The book that I suggested to you is called Beyond the Geometrical Method, a Reading of Spinoza's Ethics. It's by one of Spinoza's translators, Edwin Curley. And I sent you also the Hackett Complete works, which I recommend. Those translations are by Samuel Shirley. So Curley and Shirley, as I often remark, those are the two main Spinoza translators. And, I would say that if our listeners want a more kind of really rigorous exposition, I would look at Curley's book as a decent example of jumping into the ethics and understanding its immediate background in the Cartesian philosophical space, etc. So I don't think we should do a kind of step-by-step systematic geometrical reading of Spinoza. I think that there's a lot of that out there. I'm cool of riffing off the Deleuze and Guattari stuff, and also because I've read this a couple of times and I already had notes on here. And so there's definitely some things that we could go through. I mean, obviously, again, I could right away, we could read his definitions and his axioms. And there's also, for readers who don't want to go beyond the bounds of legality, on Project Gutenberg, there is an older translation of Spinoza that seems serviceable that one could easily find. So it's a text that is not hard to get with internet access.
Hey, didn't we discuss Spinoza a bit with Gil Morejon from What's Left of Philosophy? I know we did an episode. I remember him talking about the adequate and inadequate ideas, which may not exactly, there's not a whole lot of that here, but I think, I don't know if you recall what the basis of, I forget what we covered there.
He'll get into adequate ideas more in part 2 and I believe part 3. The only instance we kind of get of that is axiom 6. A true idea must agree with that of which it is the idea, the ideatum. And so, yeah, we talked with Morejon about Spinoza, although I think
I guess it was about his book, right? He wrote a book.
Yeah, it was about his book. Yeah, it was about his book. It was on, if I remember, it was on, I know it was on obviously Leibniz and Spinoza, and was the third Hume, I believe. Apologies to Gil, who would be nice to, I doubt he's on Twitter anymore, right? The unconscious of thought of, yeah, Leibniz, Spinoza, and Hume. So that's an episode where we talk about Spinoza. I know that you and I talked with, obviously we kind of talked a little bit about Spinoza last week with Rocky. It just kind of came up in passing. I think he asked the kind of the good question about like sort of this question of God, this question of freedom, which Spinoza will address very directly, as we already see in this book, which we should definitely discuss. We've talked about, obviously, we've done the Deleuze's book on Spinoza, right? One of the books, I think the more accessible one, the Practical Philosophy, which you can read in pretty much one sitting or couple. It's a short book, but it's very nice and dense and digestible at the same time. His book on expressionism is also good, but it's much more, I think, would serve our purposes if we read that, well, I guess, preparatory material for like difference repetition or something like that, if we were going to go down that route, which eventually we should. And what's his name? I'm blanking so bad. Oh, Michael Hart. We talked with Michael Hart a little bit in passing about Spinoza. If you recall that first episode where he kind of was very kind and speaking about friendship and the increase of each other's power and things like that, right? And referring to our bromance.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, though, I don't know how much more we've, besides, for example, like when we had Charles on and we were getting into this question of the body without organs, I mean, like Deleuze and Guattari and this may be more of a Deleuze thing, but who knows? I'm Sue Guattari went along for the ride where, Spinoza is kind of the thinker of BWO, right?
Yeah, because I was latching onto that quote.
But
I mean, it plays out here, I think, for me, interestingly.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's like at least 3 or 4 different passages that sort of, I think, really provide the logical basis for the body without organs.
Yeah, I just opened the book to the exact page, 154 of A Thousand Plateaus. All BWOs pay homage to Spinoza. It's kind of a nice little, and they say on the previous page, after all, it's not Spinoza's Ethics, the great book of BWO. The attributes are types of genuses of BWOs, substances, powers, zero intensities, matrices of production. The modes are everything that comes to pass, waves and vibrations, migrations, thresholds and gradients, intensities produced in a given type of substance starting from a given matrix. And then the Damascus body, etc. And we talked with Charles about that question, which comes in this paragraph. Is there a totality of all BWOs? The BWO is the field of immanence of desire, the plane of consistency specific to desire, with desire defined as a process of production without reference to any exterior agency, whether it be a lack that hulls it out or a pleasure that fills it. So you can see that way of defining it, as Deleuze and Guattari do, sounds very close to the way that Spinoza is going to describe God or nature or substance in this part 1.
Yeah, I wonder if it'd be a good starting point to maybe even kind of discuss because I think one of the interesting things here is the way bodies don't cause minds and minds don't cause bodies. And that sort of parallelism there. I mean, you mentioned Descartes. Obviously, this is a response to the Cartesian dualism there.
And in Rocky, that's what Rocky brought up with the pituitary gland as kind of the seed of almost like the point of convergence, if you will, the point of interaction needing to be located in the brain where the body and the mind can have a sort of interaction.
I mean, it also kind of maps up with like molar and molecular to some extent, and the sort of like if we go back to the plateau on micropolitics and segmentarity, and even just the Leibniz and the differential calculus relative to that too. I think the kind of dx dy, you could plot that out as mind and body and how they interact but they don't necessarily cause one another. They intersect, they cut one another, but they don't cause one another, which I think also goes to the notion of the body without organs to some extent, as far as I'm trying to think, maybe in the sense of the parts don't cause the body and the body doesn't cause the parts. I mean, I think there's something similar logically going on.
And by parts, of course, Deleuze and Guattari, you're talking about the body with the organs, right? That for Deleuze and Guattari, these would be intensive, quote unquote, parts, right? Rather than extensive parts as we normally think of through the imagination, as Spinoza might say, right? And you're right. It is interesting that he doesn't yet quite get deep into your initial question about bodies and thought. I think that's how Shirley translates it. Let's look at the Latin, and you can cut the. It'll take me just a second. I already had it pulled up. Okay, cogitatio. Okay, so corpus and cogitatio, right? So cogitations and bodies, thoughts. This is definition 2. A thing is said to be finite in its own kind when it can be limited by another thing of the same nature. For example, a body is said to be finite because we can always conceive of another body greater than it. So too, a thought is limited by another thought, but body is not limited by thought, nor thought by body. It is interesting that this comes so early in the book, right? Because the very first definition is by that which is self-cause, I mean that whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature can be conceived only as existing, which he's going to say is God, substance. But this next part comes up so quick in his discussion about, and he only uses it as an example. If you read that definition again, a thing is said to be finite in its own kind when it can be limited by another thing of the same nature. Right, because he's going to go from this definition that God is absolutely infinite, right, and is one and is not limited by, and therefore there's only one substance. Another substance would limit it and make it finite. But he follows in that definition, for example, and gives the body thought, which is going to anticipate his introduction of the 2 attributes of God, of which we know, thought and extension. And this sets up the question about parallelism, which we can talk about a little bit if you would like. It's just that he hasn't really yet drawn out really any of the consequences about this just yet in this book. We'll obviously be returning to it as we go deeper. But I would like to hear your thoughts about your interest in this.
I mean, I think primarily it was related to the kind of tie, what I felt was a logical tie to the molecular and the molar and segmentarity to some extent. I mean, I think the geometrical aspect has some resonance with the differential calculus as well there. But I think also, I don't know, the plane of immanence as well in terms of the parallelism or even different planes, perhaps. Like, God, I'm blanking, but right, the
virtual and the actual.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, precisely. There too, because right, they don't necessarily. Again, there's the parallelism. It's right there. It's right there in the name, right there.
I wouldn't necessarily say it mirrors the molar and the molecular, right? Only because I know what you're arguing. Molecules make up moles, right? And so their moles consist of molecules. So they wouldn't necessarily parallel as different dimensions of one and the same thing. Does that make sense? Like politics, macropolitics and micropolitics, true. Those are 2 frames of reference for one and the same politics. Does that make sense? I guess bodies and thoughts, though, obviously are a question of like of a frame of reference. And so, but I do think perhaps the virtual and the actual, it's just that for Deleuze, the question of the parallelism between those 2 would become extremely nuanced and may not work either. Although I cannot, that we would have to look at some other literature about that. But I'm going to put a pin in that one and we can return to it because because there's other texts we would need to look at. Let's just return to that question of virtual actual parallelism because it may not be as simple. And even like Spinoza's mirroring of, we could say, like physics and metaphysics here, if you want to use those big terms, right? Body and thought, or extension and thought as parallel, is going to be something that we will unpack more.
Actually, reading this, I felt like there was actually a lot more continuity between Leibniz and Spinoza as it pertains to determinism in something like The Best of All Possible Worlds. Because, I mean, obviously they're different, right? Because Leibniz is kind of positing this transcendental harmony that's imposed by God and...
Yeah, pre-established harmony is what he called it.
Versus, I think, for Spinoza, it's the immanent harmony of necessity of what, nature, or...
Yeah, of God. Right.
So kind of like, you know what I mean? So it's like it's almost like there's a sophistry element to the difference, or maybe not sophistry, but like, it's kind of like,
A distinction without a difference,
Right,
something
yeah.
like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
exactly.
and I think that Spinoza might not want to use the word harmony. If you remember
True, right. I was
if
kind
you
of riffing on the
no,
Leibniz
you're
harmony.
fine. No, you're that'd be one again. That's a distinction without a difference. Leibniz is using the word pre-established harmony. I think Spinoza is would say, like in the appendix, well, harmony is a product of our imaginations and what's sonorous to someone, blah blah blah. So he might take issue with that word because it introduces a kind of value, as though a kind of inherent value, an
Yeah, I guess
evaluation by
harmony
our
connotes pleasantness or good.
yeah, yeah,
There's
yes.
a
So
positive connotation.
as long as we're like very rigorous and rational about the word harmony, then I think pre-established harmony does work for Leibniz and Spinoza, right? If we use that, because he does say nothing, like Proposition 29, nothing in nature is contingent, but all things are from the necessity of the divine nature determined to exist and act in a definite way. So and again, Spinoza doesn't call it the best of all possible worlds, but he does basically say Proposition 33, things cannot have been produced by God in any other way or in any other order than is the case. So that's the best of all possible worlds for
Right.
Spinoza.
That's the logic.
Yeah.
The logic is similar, ultimately.
So I think the best for Spinoza, and then of all possible worlds, he might even question possible, because for him, as you saw, possible would be that God could have acted differently and could have willed things differently, etc. And for Spinoza, that's not the case, right? Because for Spinoza, as we saw, God is nature. And so
But God, I mean, am I right that he kind of says that God doesn't even will?
Yeah, basically, he doesn't want to attribute, because he says, Proposition 32, will cannot be called a free cause, but only a necessary cause. So, and the corollary is God does not act in freedom of will. So, if we can attribute to God will, and he even takes qualms of attributing intellect to God or nature, he's like, well, this is kind of a conventional way of speaking. So, for him, the only free cause is the causa sui, the self cause. That's God's free act. That's the free cause of God, the cause of himself, the causa sui. But there is no other free act or free cause.
And
One free cause, and that's a cause of itself.
Don't Deleuze and Guattari kind of riff on this as well, as far as causation?
Was this in Thousand Plateaus, or are you thinking of another text?
I just generally, I feel like they take issue with cause. Maybe I'm thinking of the quasi cause, or
there is the whole quasi cause,
but I don't know that's what I'm thinking of.
Maybe not. Yeah,
exactly.
But there is something similar where the body without organs of the earth acts as a quasi cause, appropriating to itself all of the productive forces as though it were the cause of them. Right. And the same thing with the despot, which is even clearer in the barbaric despotic regime, that the despot acts as quasi cause, acts as if it were the cause of all the productive forces that he appropriates.
I mean, that would almost go to the transcendent God that Leibniz posits in the best of all possible worlds.
That's a good question about Leibniz. Is Leibniz's God as immanent as Spinoza's? I think Deleuze would say no.
I don't know, though. I feel like there's some interesting stuff relative to, I mean, maybe making monstrous children of Leibniz and Spinoza by looking at the infinite potential for differentiation within the monads themselves. How does that differ from the infinite modes of expression or attributes, or what I've mixed modes and attributes up all the time. So feel free to hit me with a ruler, but
modes are the affections of the attributes, right? They're the affections of substance. They express the modifications of the attributes, right? And the attributes express the infinite absolute divinity, divine nature, as Spinoza likes to call it, right? So, the modes can be finite things, whereas substance and attributes are infinite. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. So it'd be like right, but let's say for Leibniz, you could argue that they have infinite I already lost my train of thought as far as modes.
Back to your point about, I think that Deleuze's reading of Leibniz is to subtract God from the equation.
Yeah.
And then the question of the convergence and divergence of series becomes one whereby there is not, and I'll use your term because I do think it's fitting, although, again, I think Deleuze, as you said, buggers Leibniz and subtracts the transcendent God who pre-establishes the harmony of the series. Because for Deleuze, he wants the rhizome, which does not have some God preordaining the convergence and divergence of series. And this is why incompossibility is interesting for Deleuze. And his way of doing this is, in the end of the day, maybe this isn't the only reason, but at the end of the day, it's to save creation. Because with Leibniz, and to a certain extent with Spinoza, but with maybe different emphasis, one might be able to say that there's nothing new under the sun. Now, I think for Deleuze, he wants to salvage creation. Now, obviously, for Spinoza, substance cannot be created. So he doesn't say that God or nature creates itself. He uses the more strict word causes itself, right? The causa sui, the self cause. And I guess my thing would be, I think Deleuze tries to, if God is subtracted, we could also say that he makes Leibniz's God Spinoza's God, which, what I'm saying, which would not be transcendent. But this is why Proposition 18, God is the immanent, not the transitive cause of all things. And I do think that he gives a very short proof for this. All things that are in God and must be conceived through God. And so God is the cause of the things that are in him, which is the first point. Further, there can be no substance external to God. That is a thing which is in itself external to God. God is the immanent, not the transitive cause of all things. So this is a pretty heretical statement following from his philosophy, because now we can see he's taking aim at classical, let's say, just call them standard or even scholastic conceptions, although not all of them had this view. Some of them were closer to Spinoza than one might think, but that's a history of philosophy thing that we can look at later in a different context. But that there would be the God of the Bible who creates us in his image. And so he is distinct from his creations. Another way of calling this is what Deleuze deals with is that God is immanent with an E rather than immanent with an I, right? The God is over and above, again, transcendence, one way of thinking it, rather than part and parcel of, although that's not even the right word, but is inseparable from creation. That's why God conceived as substance as nature is indivisible, right?
The univocity of being.
The univocity of being, I think, is also Deleuze's way of, again, because being is said in one and the same sense for all of which it is said. But that of which it is said is what differs. This is Deleuze's way of, and if you recall, and I've brought this up to you, so you may not recall, but for the listeners and for you, Coop, when we get to difference repetition, this is one of the key moments early on in the book. Deleuze does a little history of philosophy of the notion of univocity, which is where Deleuze ends up in the conclusion, the very last turns of phrase and different repetition talks about one and the same voice for the many, for the multiple, right? The clamor of being is, will become Badou's. He'll take that from Deleuze and make the title of his book on Deleuze that. But, so the history of univocity for Deleuze starts with Duns Scotus and ends with Nietzsche. And Spinoza is a middle step. And for Deleuze, Spinoza doesn't go far enough, because I think for Deleuze, and this is something that I'm maybe going over a little quickly, but I think that for Deleuze, how should I say this? Again, it's a question of multiplicity for Deleuze at the end of the day, right? So it's not a question of, I think for Deleuze, Spinoza privileges and puts the accent and the emphasis of univocity on the one, which would be the absolutely infinite substance, nature, God. And I think Deleuze is wanting to do the same thing as he did with Leibniz and subtract God out of the equation. So his turn of phrase, which is something we'll have to come back to in our reading of this book later in a different episode. But his way of thinking about it is that Spinoza made the modes turn around substance, right? Made substance the central point. And Deleuze thinks it needs to be the other way around. And that, he says, is what the eternal return is. Eternal return displaces the one, or as I've been saying, subtracts it, right? N minus one is the formula for the rhizome.
Which is really, difference the one becomes
yes.
difference. Everything is unified by difference.
Or the one becomes no longer the question of the origin and the cause and blah, 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 right? It's like, again, for Deleuze, univocity means kind of the death of the one, the death of God, etc., right? The subtraction of God from the field, from the transcendental field. again, I'm speaking very quickly because you and I haven't looked at different repetition and these other texts, so I don't want to necessarily just bring these things out of left field. But I do think, despite that, obviously, if Nietzsche is the thinker of univocity, or like the culmination of it, Spinoza plays a pivotal role. And part of it has to do with being the immanent and not the transitive cause of all things, right? Deleuze likes to say, and this is something I think Spinoza says maybe in another book or maybe in one of his letters, that if a triangle could speak, it would say that God was triangular. And this is a kind of way of saying that this is a kind of a parody, if you will, of what I was saying just a moment ago about we are made in God's image, right? As creatures, we retroactively endow God with all of the things that we have just raised to perfection. And I think Spinoza thinks that type of anthropomorphism, I know he doesn't use that term, but that kind of imaginary conception of God, to use Spinoza's term of imaginary, right? That kind of use of the imagination and not the intellect or reason is where we get these misconceptions that God is acting through willfully. God is deciding to do one thing rather than another. And I think that for Spinoza, that would be the impossibility of science. He pretty much says so in the appendix, I believe. He basically says, like, look, we can't be having a willful God that's like the God of the Hebrews. Again, this is heretical shit, right? Where there is a God who is a jealous God, to use that turn of phrase, right? That no other gods before me, and has a will and has desires and blah blah blah. Like, for Spinoza, that's not the God of science. That's not the God of philosophy. That's a God of a particular, cultural regime in a finite place and time that is endowed with these imaginary traits that are traced from the human. I'm trying to see exactly where he says that point. I'll let you speak and just while I'm looking for it, but I'm looking exactly where he kind of says, like, this would ruin the possibility of science.
That's kind of, so squaring the circle, and that's definitely meant to be tongue in cheek, would be looking at, you always like to bring up the book of Job.
Yeah.
And which also goes to contingency as well, I think, interestingly, as far as which kind of interesting relative to the way that Spinoza at least calls contingency, kind of he paints it as the ignorance of the human versus like mea su and which is like the universal nature of contingency.
Contingency is the only thing necessary. He's not dealing directly with Spinoza, but
right.
That seems, in Spinoza, that would be for Spinoza and Meillassoux couldn't be like further apart on a lot of this stuff. And I had been thinking about Meillassoux and his contention that nothing prevents the laws of nature from changing ever so slightly, ever so minuscule, perhaps obviously imperceptibly. And that already in part one of Spinoza's definitions, that's ruled out in advance from the start. As Meillassoux says, the only thing necessary is contingency itself, right? That's and so it's obviously a completely different worldview and completely different philosophy, really.
But as they both pertain to a type of determinism, whether it be immanent or transcendent, I think it's kind of, to me, it's fascinating. Just the tug of war, so to speak, if you will.
Yeah.
Because to me, the necessity aspect of Spinoza points right at contingency. In a certain sense, he is right that necessity would appear to us as, or contingency would appear to us as necessary because we lack. I mean, Spinoza says we lack the understanding of nature or whatever,
right.
But
we don't know all the causes all the way down that causes something to be necessary. That's part of our ignorance.
But contingency demands, again, though contingency means that not all possibilities can be expressed in one universe, right? Because that would be a huge contradiction in being or what have you, right?
Yeah,
which I think he even kind of goes to the illogical when he's going through the proofs of God and maybe not the substance being, you know what I mean? It'd almost be like substance being controlled by another substance or something like that. If you follow me, that might not be the best way to put it, but I feel like there's something else in his proof of God that kind of goes there, but I don't have it.
And I do think that Meillassoux means something very specific about contingency, right? And so And Spinoza is not necessarily conceptualizing it. It's more of just a rule of thumb that whatever, he says this in the Scholium of Proposition 33. A thing is termed necessary either by reason of its essence or by reason of its cause. For a thing existence necessarily follows either from its essence and definition or from a given official cause. But a thing is termed contingent for no other reason than the deficiency of our knowledge. So I don't think that's not what Mayasu was talking about with contingency, right? So they wouldn't have. I think that's where we would have to do a lot more shifting of the terminology in order to find the point of divergence that would be most fruitful. But on the face of things, we can at least say that Mayasu's contention that, well, first of all, too, this follows from his contention about the laws of nature sort of not being set in stone, which is a pretty interesting, outside of obviously Spinoza's philosophical project, because I think Spinoza, if we follow him step by step, it makes perfect sense deducing that no, the laws of nature cannot change. But if we don't start from this, then it's an interesting thought experiment to conceive or to at least admit that, sure, the laws of nature could have been different, right? If we don't start with Spinoza's God or accept Spinoza's God.
I feel like if Spinoza had been party to quantum mechanics or more advances in science, too, it might have changed his perspective on that point, just because we see how gravity behaves differently, or, it's even posited that like the forces were all unified. So like the strong magnetic, the weak magnetic, gravity, etc. Like all of these forces split off at some point during the Big Bang or whatever. And at certain points, this, I don't know, right? The speed of light would be a constant, but I'm trying to think of something else that would kind of point to this.
That the little passage, and it's in Scholium 2. And again, this is right in that same Proposition 33, which is things could not have been produced by God in any other way or in any other order than is the case. So this is the heart of your bringing up Mayasu. In Scholium 2, second paragraph, okay, so he says, so the Scholium begins, it clearly follows from the above that things have been brought into being by God with supreme perfection, since they have necessarily followed from a most perfect nature. Nor does this imply any imperfection of God, for it is his perfection that has constrained us to make this affirmation. Indeed, from its contrary, it would clearly follow, as I have just shown, that God is not supremely perfect, because if things have been brought into being in a different way by God, we should have to attribute to God another nature different from that which consideration of a most perfect being has made us attribute to him. Because again, if things were different, if the laws of nature were different, then God's essence and existence would be different. And he deals with this directly, right? But he says, however, I doubt that many will ridicule this view as absurd and will not give their minds to its examination. And for this reason alone, that they are in the habit of attributing to God another kind of freedom, very different from that which we have assigned to him. That is an absolute will, which is what we were talking about, that a willful God would be crazy. I mean, he says in the appendix, like, men imagine that there was some governor or governors who provided things for them as a means because that's how they conceive of things in the world, is what is for their advantage, is for utility. And, he says they seem to have only shown that nature and the gods are as crazy as mankind. And this is why Spinoza says, if they were willing to think the matter over, carefully reflect on our chain of proofs, they would in the end reject the kind of freedom which they now attribute to God, not only as nonsensical, but as a serious obstacle to science. And that, I think, would be where Spinoza might begin a dialogue with Mayasu, would be more or less that science would be impossible. Now, this is a Kantian type of argument too, in a certain way, not from his proofs, but Kant will have some similar type of thing based on his correlationism. And that's what Mayasu was attacking. And he wants to try to use a kind of Cartesian framework to actually say, in spite of all this question of the obstacle to science that Spinoza's making, he would want to say, it's mathematics. That's going to be, he almost takes a Badusian tack because he's a student of Baduz. Like, it's mathematics that provides the framework for eternal truth and blah, blah, blah. And so, anyway, I know that at some point, I guess we never actually read After Finitude together, right? Or did
No, we just read
that paper that I shared with you.
Yes.
Okay. Maybe sometime in the future, it'd be good to revisit him because I know he's come up in our conversations a decent amount. And I never think to and After Finitude is not that long. It's like maybe 150 pages at most, probably a little bit shorter. So, of course, we don't have to do it all in one sitting, but it would be good to revisit that. So,
where we can square the circle is to bring it back to Job, right? Because Job's friends, after all the incidents happen to Job, right? All of the devil, or do you recall even who, I forget how it's worded, who, if it's Lucifer or Satan or what the word is in Job, but maybe that's not important, right? But because basically it comes down to the wager between God and the devil or what have you, that, Job is only faithful because God blesses Job. And so
because of the utility that, because he's getting an advantage. And I'm not sure. I have to see if it's. I would guess it's Satan, because we're talking about Aramaic Hebrew. Lucifer is a Latinate term, right? The bearer of light, the light bringer. And yeah, there you go. Satan is, as you know, adversary, right? And in any case, you're right. At the end, or towards the end, before he gets everything back tenfold or whatever the fuck, which is always weird. All of his friends are like, "Man, you must have really done some fucked up shit, Job. Like, what did you do? Yeah, you did some kind of fucked up shit, buddy." And that is obviously, for Spinoza, that would be not a rational induction. We're anthropomorphizing God's will, even if the story is, to be fair, not Spinoza's God, right? It's the God of the Hebrews, and it's dramatized this way that God is playing a game, making a wager. And Job actually, he does finally come to the breaking point where he asks why, like, why did you do that, God? He finally breaks, and God's like, "Bro, you don't know me." He's like, "You have no idea. Your ignorance cannot conceive of the reasons for the way things are." And I think that's where that answer, and even though the story ends with Job, being sort of given back things, you got to think that's got to be some PTSD, man. You got to have some nightmares about all that shit. And in any case, I do think that's why I think Job is it has at least somewhat of a Spinozistic payoff, because it teaches us not to trust our moral interpretations of the universe, right? The bad things happen to bad people for the bad acts that they do. And we see things like that in Ecclesiastes. At least I think it's Ecclesiastes, right? Where, the wisest man ever lived, Solomon or whatever, is kind of saying the rain falls or the sun shines on the good and the wicked alike. Right. It's that we should not ascribe a moral interpretation to God's acts. I think that in Spinoza's views, it's those who want to retain their power that want to perpetuate the ignorance that they are like the priests and the prophets, that they have some kind of direct connection with the unknown phenomena of nature. And I think for Spinoza, he's like, no, this is the realm of science, and science is meant to dispel our servitudes that we fall into, and that we thereby give power to those over us who would be the charlatans, the priests, the prophets, that would claim to have some sort of connection with God's will. If we subtract God's will out of the equation, because God is nothing but nature and the direct consequences of nature, then those people lose their authority. Ignorance and superstition are, if not eradicated, at least in that area, minimized. People regain some of their independence and autonomy, or at least some of their a degree of freedom from that oppression or that authority. Yeah. Anyway, this is why Reich's question in Anti-Oedipus: why does it desire its own repression? Right? How do people fight for their servitude and as though their freedom is Spinoza's question? Right. This is how they frame it, at least in Anti-Oedipus.
So I think tied to this actually made. When reading this, I even texted you or sent you this quote from Dune. Everybody's going to throw tomatoes at me, but this is good. This is good. I'll go ahead.
Bear with me, guys. It'll pay off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm not totally full of shit all the time. So this quote: "When God hath ordained a creature to die in a particular place, he causeth that creature's wants to direct him to that place." So obviously there's a determinism here in play, but I think it's one that echoes Spinoza in a certain way, and like an eminent necessity. If you're looking at, and if we were bringing something like Conatus and the creature's desires, or like whatever, it's desire to fulfill I don't know. You have to help me out on Conatus there.
Well, Conatus is sort of it's continuation, it's perseverance in being, right? And I know that's, I'm paraphrasing and I'm probably doing a bad job. We'll come up to that, but I've always likened Panadas to will to power. So, will to power is obviously not willing for power, but the sort of inner affirmation of the force of existence and perfection to the highest degree, to the nth degree, right? Nietzsche wouldn't use the word perfection there, so I'm kind of Spinozizing Nietzsche, but
all of that, the creature's wants, etc., leading to its sort of predestined end, are part of the expression of necessity and not a transcendent, which is kind of ironic, right? Or almost a contradiction to some extent. This is where I think the Leibniz-Spinoza nexus is interesting to compare and contrast, because I
guess it would be if Herbert's,
especially when you throw in contingency as well, it becomes even more murky.
If Herbert's God, if we interpret it as a Spinozistic God, then the wants and inclinations leading the creature to die where it's supposed to at a given time would be fair if, again, it's an imminent cause, right? Because it would follow from the direct chain of consequences ad infinitum back to God's self cause. And what and as you see here, and we talked with, I think this is what we talked, one of the things we talked with Michael Hart about, is Spinoza not just denies freedom of will for God, but freedom of will in general. And if you remember when we were talking with Michael Hart, it's unfreedom of the will, because the will is determined in a series of causes all the way down, of which we cannot have all of the information. But there's a freedom of the intellect, if you want to call it that. Unfreedom of the will, freedom of the intellect. Or we can use some other word than freedom of the intellect if you want, but it's just because the will is determined in a certain way all the way down. There is a sense, and I think this comes down to Deleuze's affirmationism, as you might want to call it in a maybe a silly way. But, when Deleuze is saying not to be unworthy of what happens to us, that is a freedom of the intellect. We have at least a degree of freedom to resign ourselves to things and to become resentful and to allow for the proliferation of the reactive forces that threaten to submerge us in, like when we were talking about stratification and stuff, right? That there's a way we can resign ourselves to the strata and act as though we do not have any means of fighting for tipping the strata towards the body without organs, or tipping the assemblage, or whatever. You know what I'm saying? But I think for Spinoza, that's the same thing. There's something similar where our intellect is what allows us to take a certain point of view on what is happening to us, even on our will and our desires, right? This is even a kind of, you could say, a Stoic conception in the philosophical sense, not in the popular sense, in the sense in which we have the ability to become aware of the things that are within our power to change and that aren't. And we have the power to limit our desires from that which is unnecessary, right? That which would be extrinsic to it, that would impede the process of production, to speak like Deleuze and Guattari, right? Which, pleasure being one of them, which gets us back to our thing about Freud and the pleasure principle, and how he does seem to be at times closer to Deleuze's imminent process of desire than not. So I do think that the imaginary, or the illusion we're under, or the imagination, leads us to believe that, of course, our will is free, because that is supposedly the essence from which our ego strives to claim to be free, to speak in a Freudian sense, right? When we know that the ego is kind of sandwiched, if you will, if you want to use the top-down model, it's sort of sandwiched from the pressures of the superego and from the bubbling up, the effervescences of the id that's threatening us with the domination of the drives to desire beyond death, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I do think that we have to keep in mind Spinoza's unfreedom of the will, without saying, well, I guess that means I'm just a determined being, and so I resign myself to things. It's not the consequences of what he's saying. I think it's less, for the emphasis, I think, for Spinoza, is less about this idealistic type of and hubristic type of belief in some sort of self-caused freedom, which, as you know, he reserves self-cause for nature alone. And it's more about the fact that there is a causal chain of events, however obscure, that can always be traced down. And creation ex nihilo is, we only reserve that for the first cause, or if you want to speak like you like to, the determination in the last instance or something, right? The DLI is free cause, but only of itself and not of anything else. Everything else is determined in a definite and determinate way. I think that's Spinoza's elegant rationalist, and in the immaterialist, if you want to use that word with reservations, about the concatenation of sequences of events and causal chains that are ultimately the domain of science and the intellect to uncover, and not some realm above and beyond whether it be some heaven of ideas or some God who is, like, you remember Descartes' methodical doubt, where he starts to doubt all the things that he's known. And he's led to this kind of almost dark night of the soul, where he's like, what if everything I've ever known is provided by a malicious God, an evil spirit, an evil genie that is deceiving me, which he has to rule out for his own reasons. But it's a very interesting thought experiment. And I think Spinoza is doing something similar, that God is not this willful, wrathful thing over and above us that threatens us with damnation. We are in God. We are like inseparable from God. We are modes of, we are modes of the attributes of thought and extension that is not separate from God in any way. But if God himself does not have free will, then even much more so do we not have free will. And I think that the romanticization of free will is not Spinoza's concern, because that's outside of rational considerations. And I think that's why this appendix to the first book is kind of like, look, there's all these prejudices that we have based on again, I'm using this term that he doesn't use, these anthropomorphizing tendencies that we have. That's not actually a product of intellect, but it's a product of the imagination. We insert ourselves everywhere and see ourselves in all things, when that is a way of rationalizing to our advantage. It not just rationalizes, it rationalizes in a bad way, because it makes nature and God as crazy as mankind, as he says, which is the obstacle to science. So ultimately, if there were free wills everywhere, science would be impossible, especially if there were a willful God that had caprices and whims. And again, I think this is why you were really, really smart to bring up Meillassoux. You like cut to the heart of some of the issues that Spinoza is trying to avoid, or at least, trying to overcome with his deductions, his process of building these propositions.
Really fascinating to consider, like Paul Muad'Dib in that context of determinism and having an actual will, because of the events we see play out in Dune Messiah, which I won't harp on too much, but in a way he's sort of trapped by the same causal right? There's only one path that he can walk because of the sort of chain of events that have taken place to kind of create this best of all possible worlds, which itself is, I forget who it was that says that Leibniz's idea of the best of possible worlds is a hellish landscape. I think that resonates so strongly with that book, but I won't bore people with that stuff. But if you are interested, that's maybe what fascinates me so much about Dune Messiah in particular as a work. The question of determinism and all of these issues that get expressed, and having a will and having, be the most powerful being in the universe is constrained, right? There's not free will to do as they please, whole cloth. They are even constrained, even perfect knowledge of the future. It's interestingly, they say that it's fatal, which I think is kind of cool, but I don't want to take us down that road too much further.
Yeah, and this is why I said earlier that I don't think Spinoza would be able to speak when he says, again, this is proposition 33, which is one of the last propositions in this part. Things could not have been produced by God in any other way or in any other order than is the case. I don't think it's equivalent to what Leibniz is getting at with the best of all possible worlds. But for Spinoza, first of all, I don't think he would like the notion of possible worlds itself, as though, again, God could exist in another form and as another substance. But the best for Spinoza, it's like, no, there's one world, there's one God, there's one nature, there's one substance. So calling it the best, you can't use a superlative for the one, right? Sure, absolutely infinite, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you can do that. But to call it the best, again, is kind of an evaluation that the imagination makes, and not that the intellect makes. What does that mean, the best? He might call it's perfect by its own nature, by its essence, but to call it best already kind of, again, for the two reasons I laid out, it implies an evaluation of our own that looks to our advantage. And secondly, it involves an idea whereby there is more than one substance, which he rejects pretty categorically, right? So
I think to wrap up, I could go through a couple of passages that I felt to me exemplified the logic of the body without organs.
okay.
So I'll go ahead and read these in kind of quick succession. However, for a fuller explanation, I will refute my opponent's arguments, which all seem to come down to this. Firstly, they think that corporeal substance, insofar as it is substance, is made up of parts, and so they deny that it can be infinite, and consequently that it can pertain to God. This they illustrate with many examples, of which I will take one or two. They say that if corporeal substance is infinite, suppose it be divided into two parts. Each of these parts will either be finite or infinite. If the former, then the infinite is made up of two finite parts, which is absurd. If the latter, then there is an infinite, which is twice as great as another infinite, which is also absurd.
Well, it denies that natura naturans, which is God as self-cause, God as substance, as self-cause substance, can be divided up into parts, that it has parts. And he uses that part where he says look, yes, water in terms of being an extended thing is divisible, but in terms of substance is indivisible. Which it would be like saying, again, he's making an argument for an intensive view of substance, to use a Deleuzian term, and not for an extensive view, even though thought and extension are the two attributes of God. Even if we can sort of divide up space in a way that suits our utility, and we can argue about different thoughts being distinct from one another and being broken out into component parts, extension and thought as attributes infinitely expressive of substance, insofar as they are substance, that's indivisible. Now, the modes through which the attributes are expressed and that are modifications of the attribute, those can be divisible. Does that make sense? So this is why he warns us that the intellect is, where does he do this? He warns us and says that the intellect in acts, finite or infinite, as well as will, desire, love, etc., must be related to natura, naturata, not natura, naturans. And if you want to use English, I sometimes translate it, or I've seen it translated as naturing nature and natured nature, which probably looks is silly in Latin, but so our intellect doesn't deal with naturing nature, right? When we are apprehending the causes of things, because naturing nature is purely just the self-cause from which everything follows. And that from which everything follows, the modes of is natured nature. That's what we deal with, right? In our perceptions and our scientific investigations.
I think I grabbed this quote twice by accident, but here, I think this is just a continuation. However, the student who looks carefully into these arguments, I think you might have read this too, will find that I have already replied to them, since they were all founded on the same supposition that material substance is composed of parts. And this I have already shown to be absurd. So I thought that was another little riff that Deleuze had on the body without organs. I'll see if I can find this other quote, but please feel free to intervene here. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so I think that was it. Anyways, I just felt that kind of, I don't know what you would refer to it as, but the way that the parts and the way that he views them, I think, sets up the logic of the body without organs.
Yeah.
For better or worse, that's my assertion.
Yeah, let's see. Absolutely infinite substance is indivisible. Now, and the same thing with the body without organs not having extensive parts. This is why Deleuze talks about BWOs do not change without changing in kind, which basically means they're not going to change by degrees, because again, that would imply parts. It's a multiplicity, so it is kind of a holistic view whereby it is its changes. That's kind of
that's good.
That's basically what Deleuze is saying, and that's why, as we'll see, and I think they use the terminology already, but when they describe longitude and latitude of bodies, they're being Spinozistic, because we're talking about, relations of movement and rest. We're talking about, and Spinoza himself goes into this question of movement and rest in that thing about will, right? Where he says, will pertains to God's nature no more than do other natural phenomena. It bears the same relationship to God's nature as does motion and rest and everything else that we have shown to follow from the necessity of the divine nature to be determined by that divine nature to exist and to act in a definite way. So, like for Spinoza to talk about God's will as though it could change on a whim would be like saying that as though things, as a motion and rest, the laws of motion and rest could just change at random. And
that's funny with Meyasu, like we said, though, too, right?
yeah. I mean, like for Meyasu, it's not even about like that, he wants to push the Kantian framework to a point, its breaking point, because Kant wants to say that, nature its laws are formed in such a way that they are one and the same with the laws of our mental apprehension, right? That's the correlationism. And so if they could change, then that means that they would become out of sync with the laws of our mental functioning, our psychical apparatus, to use Freud's term, right? And thereby we would live in a chaotic world. There would be chaos if there wasn't some sort of correlation. And I think Meyasu is trying to push that argument to its limit and saying that beyond our sort of faith, or even like a Humean type of, well, the sun rose yesterday, so it will rise tomorrow, we have this continued expectation that the laws of nature will remain constant for no other reason than that we have an investment in that. But again, like his argument is not necessarily like that the speed of light could shift to something measurably different. He's almost making this question about imperceptible changes that nevertheless would yield a series of differences. Again, I think if we read After Finitude, we can kind of be able to pull more on this thread of Spinoza, because I don't even know if he brings up Spinoza in After Finitude. I haven't read it in a while, so I could be wrong. So listeners, if I'm wrong, I think but because he's bringing to bear Descartes against Kant, it makes very much sense that we could make easy shifts and Spinoza would be right there, right? So
last thing I'll say is I feel like there's something about the proposal that the speed at which things are moving apart in the universe is increasing, which that would be like, that's extension, right?
Well, that's a mode of extension, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that is a law of nature changing, right?
That's true.
That's just a shift at a certain rate.
Or is that an intensive shift, maybe?
I guess, at least for Spinoza's point, and yes, I mean, it would obviously be a mode that's affecting extension, but it is an intensive, it has to do with intensity, right? So it's,
Any final thoughts you want to add before we wrap up?
I guess I will say that what I like about this part one is it immediately gets the heretical stuff right out of the way. Right? Because when Spinoza is arguing for the existence of God necessarily following, he's not arguing for the existence of a personal anthropomorphized God. When he's talking about the existence of God, he's talking about the existence of nature, right? We have to remind ourselves that. So he is not making, even though Descartes makes an ontological proof for the existence of God, that's, to me, I don't think Descartes is necessarily as interested in making the heretical move that the God of which he is talking about is nature, because precisely in his methodological doubt, he's worried at first that God could be a deceiver. So he's already anthropomorphizing God somewhat, right? And it is, even though he is philosophically describing God in similar ways to Spinoza as, perfect and blah, blah, blah. He has different lists of God's attributes in his meditations. So I think that heretical move, starting with that, is very important. And so it's not a question of atheism or theism if we agree in our reading of Spinoza that God necessarily exists. We don't have to agree that some Christian God necessarily exists or some God of any religion exists, because Spinoza isn't talking about a theological, he's not doing theology. This isn't titled theology. This is the ethics, which we can come back to. And as you remember, we discussed Deleuze's distinction between morality and ethics being an eminent mode of acting versus the top-down imposition of values and norms. So in any sense, I do think that starting with this, and we could call it an atheistic God if we want to be seemingly oxymoronic, But I don't think it is oxymoronic to call that. We start with this heretical God devoid of religion. So if Spinoza doesn't subtract the one in the sense that Deleuze is talking about multiplicity, he at least subtracts the one of religion from his conception of God. And that is a pretty radical start that I think is very cool. And that's why, again, his way of doing this isn't in order to like make room for faith, or he's not trying to convert religious zealots. He's trying to build this rational system for scientists, for philosophers who are not concerned with their personal salvation by a personal God. And he's not trying to convince us of a kind of faith. This isn't a book that's going to be tugging on those kind of religious heartstrings. He has evacuated all the superstitious, imaginary implications that we endow God with in the religions in which we were raised. And so I think that type of leveling of the playing field is extremely interesting. And again, that's not the least of reasons of which why he was almost stabbed to death and was excommunicated, yada yada, because God-like opinion is people find it comforting, right? It can shelter us from the chaos of the world, the chaos. It can order our life in a way that is comfortable and useful. And then Spinoza is going to be challenging all those comforts we may have, including like freedom of the will, right? That is a comfort. That is an opinion that we have, that we conceive of ourselves as these like free, independent beings. And I think Spinoza's freedom it's not that there is no freedom, it's that what we consider to be the freedom of the will is an illusion, right? And it has to be, and including from God. So when we think of God as this absolutely willful being, we are making him into a despot. And that, obviously monarchy was still the main mode of politics at the time. And so it again reflects our prejudices that God would be like the despot ruling over the universe. And Spinoza forces us to tackle that superstition and that prejudice in order for us to do science and follow scientifically and rationally what he's going to have us deduce, which is going to lead for him to, beatitude is what he calls it. But, Deleuze, we could, call it, the affirmationism and blah, blah, blah. It requires us to have to sacrifice some of those things that we have found so comfortable and useful and protecting our like sanity or our value system or our unconscious investments, our prejudices too, because we cling to those as well. Sometimes it helps us to order our universe in a way. And I think that Spinoza is trying to say, look, the universe is ordered in a much, much more different way than we spontaneously believe it is. But if we follow him, it's actually thereby, in its rational exposition, it's actually more comforting in a certain way. It can lead us to a firm existence, if you will, in a way that's than we ever thought possible. Because even Meillassoux, with his divine in existence, is still tackling questions like, well, God does not yet exist, but in the future he will, and he'll redeem all the bad shit that's been happening. And for Spinoza, that's not a problem for Spinoza. This problem of needing a God to blame for the evils in the world, for Spinoza, that is not a healthy way of thinking about things, not a rational way of thinking about things. And if God cannot act otherwise, doesn't have free will, then there is no being that needs to save existence from the evils that we believe it has, or there is no God that can be blamed for the evils that mankind brings into the world. This is why Spinoza will have that very interesting view that evil is an epiphenomenon. Right. It's the same way with Deleuze, that negation is epiphenomenal. And I think that Deleuze sees in, especially, not the only one, but in Spinoza especially, that affirmation is a part of his system, which is why it is, the famous Pierre Macherey book, Hegel or Spinoza. I do think you have to choose. And we see what Deleuze chooses. And Hegel himself kind of is caught saying like, well, all philosophers can either follow the path that I'm trying to lead us on or be Spinozist. There's no other way. So Hegel himself recognized at this time that something of what we might call Spinoza's affirmationism And yeah.
We'll call that a wrap for this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. See y'all next week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.